So yeah, so working as a journalist, filmmaker, and content strategist requires you to write a lot, a lot, a lot. And it is exactly my love for writing, which is what made me pursue these things in the first place. Says that good writers are developed, they are made, and exactly what Laksh was trying to say, that it takes practice and work. For whoever like, there's a very big misconception about writers which says that you're always born with an extra set of creativity, that some people are just better at writing, that some people are just better at expressing themselves. The only reason that those people are probably a little better than you is because they have a little more practice than what you have at this point. It's all practice, it's all work. There's no one who is not a writer and can't become one. So in that sense, anyone can be a writer, and there's no age for it, you know. What does creativity, when you think of creativity or when someone says creativity, what's the first thing that comes in your head?
Something
All
original
right.
that is made by
Something
myself,
out of the
or
box.
something that nobody else could
Unique
think
ideas.
in that way.
Very interesting.
Something out of the box.
Interesting. So you're right. Creativity is the ability to create something new, something that did not exist earlier till you thought it through from your head and made it happen. So it's like creating something magical, creating something beautiful right out of your head. That's like your mind baby of sorts. So you're making it in your head and you're creating something while you're it's absolutely original, it's your idea. So in that sense, creativity is the ability to create something new. And in the same line of thinking, creative writing then becomes the process of writing to create something beautiful. Creative writing is essentially done. The purpose of every writer is to make the world a better place. So like, with what they write, with what they try to express, they're trying to add beauty to this world, in the sense that they're trying to help people who can't probably express themselves as better as they think they are. Writing essentially is of many types, but it can be demarcated, or it can be sort of put in two different buckets, which are creative writing and content writing. So creative writing is the kind of writing you do for the soul. This is the writing that you do for your personal thing. This is the diary entry that you make, the poem that you write, the any sort of personal writing, even if it's a personal essay that you're writing on your mom or on your pet, whatever it is, that's essentially creative writing. It's also a lot of plays and movies. So every movie that you see has once been a story which was written by someone who has been creative enough to imagine that story. Even plays for that matter, or fiction and non-fiction literature. I'm including non-fiction literature here because a lot of non-fiction literature also uses a lot of imaginative and creative writing to bring forth the reality that they're trying to show through that book. On the other hand, content writing is writing purely for academic, technical, commercial, or journalistic purposes. It's essentially what you do in a research paper, in a website content, or in the sense that if you're someone who works as at an advertising agency, or say a tech brand, then the kind of writing that you're doing is essentially for a particular purpose, which is either commercial, journalistic, technical, or academic. I've been a journalist, and I can tell you that the difference between a good journalist and a bad journalist is exactly how well they tell their stories. So creative writing can also be a part of academic writing, technical writing, commercial and journalistic purposes if you do it well. But one common similarity that runs between both of these things is that both of them require research and the ability to tell stories. So research is essentially all that you think from the beginning, which I'll actually explain later when we come to the storytelling process. And the other thing is just plain old storytelling. As humans, I think all of us are winded in such a way that we want to tell stories. So in that sense, yeah, like both of them, both creative and content writing, are essentially forms of storytelling that require a lot of research. Now we'll come to what exactly a story is. So Jean-Luc Godard is one of the biggest names in cinema, okay, in French cinema. And he said that a story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. So there can be movies that start with the end, or there can be stories that start with the end and end at the beginning. And there can be stories which don't have a timeline per se. So it can start from the middle, but then it can go to the end and come back to the beginning again, and then go back to the end again. So in terms of that, a story needs to have a beginning, middle, and end, but it can be placed in any order that you want. Any permutation combination that works can be done. In the same sense, a story has 5 particular elements that you need to take care of. A story definitely needs to have a setting. Now, what is a setting? A setting is where the story is set or located. So setting can be your time period and the kind of world that you're trying to show through your story. Characters are people who become a part of your story. So any story needs to have a character, be it non-fiction or fiction. Every story needs to have someone who is a part of that story, whose story you are telling. So that becomes your character. And characters in a story are always developed. So there'll always be a journey of a character. The third element is plot and structure. So structure, you guys understand, is very basic, that it can be a beginning, middle, and end, or any order of things. Plot is essentially the story that you're trying to tell, the story itself that you're trying to tell. Then we come to message or theme. Okay, so message or theme is essentially what you're trying to show through that film. So the core central idea or the core central message that you're trying to put forth through a film or a story or a novel, what is the idea that you're trying to bring forth? The last thing that's left is tone and perspective. Two of these things, which are very, very interesting, which can either make your story or break your story. So tone is essentially the kind of way in which you try to tell your story. So the way or the method of telling a story is essentially your tone. Perspective is like, by whose eyes are you seeing that story? So perspective can be through the eyes of a character, or it can be from the third eye perspective. So moving on, we'll come to the most basic structure of telling a story. It's called Freytag's 5-act structure. So it has 5 stages. The first stage is called exposition, then there is rising action, then there is climax, falling action, and denouement. Okay, so think of it as exposition is introduction of the story. So every story, Freytag says that every story has a character, a conflict, and there is the resolution of that conflict. So think of exposition as when the story is beginning. So that writer is only trying to, tell you a situation that has already happened. Okay, ye 1940s mein this story took place. This is what happened. We were an agricultural based country where we were fighting the British. So that becomes your exposition, is basically your introduction, where you're introducing who the character is, where you're introducing what is happening. Rising action is when the characters in that story go through a conflict. Now, conflict can be any sort of problem that comes in front of the character, any problem. So there needs to be a mission that the character needs to go on to achieve it. So rising action is essentially the place where the conflict sets in. And then the conflict is basically, there's lots of dishum, there's lots of mar, or there is lots of other things that take place. And rising action is essentially that it keeps rising, it keeps getting worse, it keeps getting worse, it keeps getting worse, till it reaches the point of climax. Now, climax is the turning point of sorts. So because from climax, you're only coming down. So climax is your turning point where the rising action has come to its peak. It can't get worse than that. So climax is where, like there'll be some dishum dishum, there will be something, someone who may die in that dishum dishum or whatever it is that takes place, or some sort of a climax where you think that the story can't go worse than this. And then there is a falling action where the characters grow, where the characters think that, okay, what, we've had the realization, we have learned our lesson, and now we will live happily. So falling action is when they're having that process of learning. And finally, denouement is basically the ending of the story where the conflict is resolved and they're all living happily ever after. So this is essentially the Freytag's 5-act structure, wherein a story begins with the introduction. There is a conflict that comes. The conflict becomes very, very, very large, reaches a climax, comes back, and like there's a resolution at the falling action stage, and denouement is where they live happily ever after. Now we will move to something that will make this very easy for you. This is called the hero's journey chart. So the hero's journey is basically this particular thing that you're trying to show throughout a film, any film that you can think of. Say, I will tell you an example of the Karate Kid. Like, like a lot of you mentioned that generally it's, like the Freytag's 5-act structure is not applicable throughout films, which I agree with. But the hero's journey is something that is applied to most of the films that you can think of. Most of them. So it starts with the start where you just introduce the hero. Hero is there. You understand that hero or heroine, for that matter, it can be a woman as well. There is a person that you introduce right at the start. At the beginning itself, when you're trying to establish their world, their normal world, there will be a call to adventure. Like a lot of you mentioned that it doesn't always have to be violent. There will be some sort of a call for adventure. So there will be a call for adventure, and they'll go through that call for adventure. Then they'll meet a mentor and cross the threshold. They'll go through a lot of trials, they'll go through a lot of failure, and then they'll grow. And then they'll come to the death or rebirth stage, where either, like there will be a death or like there'll be a rebirth. But it doesn't have to be death in the sense that you die and then you are born, there is a punarjanam that takes place. No, it can also be that you become a different person with a lot of growth. Then there is revelation. You are finally a changed person. You have atoned for all your sins. You have realized all your lessons. You get a particular gift, and then you return a changed person, and that's the ending of it. So next we move on to the creative process itself. What is the creative process? How do we tell stories? How do we end up writing a story and then bringing it to life? What is the process in which we try to do these things? So it essentially has 5 steps, and 5 steps makes it sound very easy, which it is, but you will realize when you're writing that there will be points that you'll be stuck at. So it starts with the ideation stage. Now the ideation stage is where you come up with the idea that, okay, you know what, I want to write a story about this pandemic, or I want to write a story about my dog and his journey, or I want to write a story about a child and like him trying to find what he wants to become in life. So whatever it is, whatever your idea is, essentially happens in the ideation stage. Before anything that takes place, there needs to be an idea that you need to think of, and that becomes the basis of your story. So ideation is essentially the planning that you take for a story. So once you have the idea, then you start planning. Okay, this is what I want to show through my novel. This is what I want to tell the reader. This is what I want to tell through my story. So in that stage, you plan a structure. You think that, okay, you know what, I now have an idea that this is what I want to show. Now I'll make a structure. Now I will write what the introduction will be, how I will show that. Will I start from the ending and then end at the beginning? Do I want to have a very different timeline from what people have had? Do I want to research, then The next stage you come to is the drafting stage. Drafting stage is you begin with writing everything that you can think of. So everything that the first impressions that you have, you begin with a rough draft. And at every point that you're stuck, uh, one thing that really helps me and a lot of other writers that I can tell you about is asking the question, what if? So every point that when you're writing and you're stuck, think of a possibility that you haven't thought of. So just keep the draft and then think of a possibility. Oh my God, what if my character at this point, and then fill in the blanks. So for example, for a story that I wrote, I was like, what if my character at this point loses his job? Then comes the revising stage where you've written your first draft. You think it's fine, it's not that great that you wanted it to be, but now you're sitting and revising it. So now is the time you'll use beautiful words. You will use different ways in which you can show the reader the world that you're trying to build through your story. You'll revise it, the language. You'll try to figure out, is this tone working or not, is this perspective working or not, and you'll try to revise a lot of those things. Then comes the editing stage. Now the editing stage can be done as a self-editing process, where if you think that you're good at grammar and you're good at punctuation and a lot of these things, then you can edit your own stuff as well. But generally how it's done is that when a writer has written something, they will bring it to an editor. They'll submit their book to an editor, and the editor will then proofread that book for them, or whatever, like the first impressions that the editor will give. These are highly specialized people who will help you. So say Penguin, if you publish something through Penguin Random House or through HarperCollins, you'll send a manuscript and they'll look over at your manuscript, and then they'll come up with a contract where they'll say that like say whatever money you make from selling these books, we will do the marketing for you, we will do the publicity for you, we will set up interviews for you and all of these things, and we'll release your book through our name and through our publishing house. And whatever copies that you sell, we get 20% or 30% of it. So that's a contract that you make. So you're not actually paying them beforehand, but whatever you make sort of gets given in that process. In terms of the hacks to be a good writer, this is the last thing that we're going to be talking about. Again, there is no way of being a good writer than practicing. And the only way you can do that is by reading, by writing, and by observing a lot. Be simple in your writing. Always when you're writing the first draft, be very, very simple. Fancier or bigger words or using complicated language is not better. Simple, it's always things that touch your heart that are actually better than the ones who use a lot of big words but don't really touch your heart as much. So in terms of your language, always try to be simple, always try to be brief. One of the biggest things that every writer needs to understand is to communicate in as brief and as small sentences as possible. Research, the more you know, the better you write. Try and read about different things, try and research. So if you have an idea in head, try and think about it from different standpoints, try and read on it, try and google that idea, try to talk it to your friends, to experts who know about that idea. So researching always helps. Prompts is one way I use practice as like prompts I use very, very regularly for practice. And these can be visual, verbal, or written prompts. So suppose you have an old picture that you see from anywhere in a book or in a magazine or whatever. It's an old picture, whatever picture. Try to construct a backstory to that picture. Try to construct how that picture even happened. Try to deconstruct why that picture was taken, stuff like that. Those can be visual references. They can be verbal references. So say someone gives you a very good advice, or someone says something very interesting or something very humorous to you in a conversation. Try to use that line, try to write it down, and try to then think about it more, to write at least a page about it, about what you feel about that one particular thing someone said. So write about absolutely anything that you're thinking at one particular time. You can do it at any point of the day. I prefer doing it in the morning, but you can choose whatever time you want to do it. So yeah, these are basically the hacks to be a good writer.